My mother threw me out so she could move her new boyfriend in, and then she acted like I was the reason our family was broken. Can you imagine arriving at your house, the place where you pay the rent, only to discover your entire life crammed into trash bags? That's what happened to me. I got home from work one random Tuesday, exhausted, drenched in sweat and ready to just fall apart, and there was my mom standing in the living room with Mark, her new boyfriend, looking at me as if I was invading their space. The very first thing she said, "We need to have a discussion." At first, I thought maybe she had some bad news, like she wasn't feeling well or we were having money problems. But then she pointed toward the trash bags near the front door. And then she dropped the bomb. "Mark is moving in and we need your room. You have until tonight to be gone." I actually laughed. I really believed it was a prank. I even said, "That's a good one, Mom." But she didn't smile. Her expression remained completely serious. That's when I got a sinking feeling in my gut. I'm only 21. I work 2 jobs, one as a barista in the mornings, and I stock shelves at a grocery store at night. I pay my portion of the rent. I buy my own food. Heck, I even paid for the internet at home because my mom always claimed she couldn't swing the cost. I wasn't some lazy kid just sitting around playing video games constantly. I was contributing, and more than that. My mom and I were once really close. My dad went away when I was 15, and for a while it was just the two of us against everything. I helped her get through the divorce, even took on. I had a part-time job during my high school years to assist with the household expenses. I really felt we had a good connection with one another. Then Mark entered the picture. In my opinion, he wasn't anything special, just some guy she had met online a short while back. Because he resided a couple of hours away, I hardly ever saw him, but whenever he did visit, he behaved like he was the boss. He would make remarks about how the house was messy, or that my mother deserved better than being here. He also displayed a weird territorial behavior, always shadowing her as if he didn't have faith in her ability to be alone. I wasn't a fan of him, but I assumed he would eventually disappear. My mom had other boyfriends before him, and none of them remained. I never anticipated him moving in, much less forcing me out of the house. The conflict commenced instantly. I questioned her. "What do you mean I have to go? Where am I supposed to go?" She just let out a deep breath as if I was being irrational and replied, "You're old enough to figure it out. Mark is experiencing a difficult period and he needs a new beginning. Be supportive for once." Supportive. For Mark, the individual I hardly know, the person who's taking my space and kicking me out of the home I assist in paying for. I told her this was crazy, that I couldn't afford to just pack up and leave. She showed no concern. "You've mentioned moving out for a while now," she replied. "This is the impetus you require." Moving out was something I aimed to do, but on my schedule. Not like this. Not because some random dude decided my room would be a cool space for him. The awful thing, Mark never even spoke during the whole thing. He simply remained there wearing a smirk. The arrogance etched across his face made my anger surge. I gestured towards him, stating, "This is all you're doing, isn't it?" My mother immediately came to his defense. "Don't put the blame on him," she insisted. "All he's done is offer me love and encouragement, which is more than I can say for you." I was stunned by her words, love and support. Coming from the man who suggested she get rid of the cat, claiming it was too much trouble. From the man who convinced her to cancel our yearly family Christmas dinner because he disliked large groups. I finally saw that this situation wasn't about me being a terrible daughter or Mark needing a fresh beginning. This was about power. Mark wanted me gone so he could have Mom and the house exclusively. Collecting my things in a single afternoon felt unreal. I crammed as much as possible into my car, clothes, my laptop, and some personal belongings, though there was so much I couldn't take. I had to leave behind furniture, books, and even the stuffed animals from my childhood. Mom offered very little help. She just stood in the doorway, observing, appearing eager for me to depart. As I reached for Bella, my cat, Mark actually had the nerve to ask, "Are you certain you want to take her?" "She's comfortable here. Perhaps it's best if she stayed." That was my breaking point. Facing him, I declared, "You don't get to tell me what's best for my cat." Then, looking at my mom, I said, "I hope he's worth it." She remained silent as I stepped outside. Mark shouted after me. "Best of luck," he said. "Don't come running back when things fall apart." I was tempted to yell, to chuck something, anything to make him experience even a tiny amount of the hurt and fury that was swirling inside me. However, instead, I just climbed into my car with Bella riding shotgun and drove away. Currently, I'm crashing on a friend's sofa. I'm grateful that I had somewhere to go, yet this isn't a long-term solution. I can't currently manage to pay for my own apartment, not with how expensive rent has become. Each time I contemplate how my mom discarded me like I was worthless, I'm overwhelmed with a combination of fury and devastation. There's a side of me that wants to completely sever ties with her, to block her number and act like she doesn't exist. Still, A different part of me can't help but wonder what will happen if Mark decides she's no longer useful. Will she find herself isolated, penniless, and regretting everything? I'm unsure what will come next. Looking back, I initially believed I was simply resentful and angry about being pushed out, but later, small things began occurring that made me realize this wasn't just about a lousy boyfriend. Mark had a scheme. Sadly for my mom, she was too blinded by her feelings for him to recognize it. It began with a text. A few days after I left, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It simply said, "Stay out of it. You aren't welcome here anymore." I immediately knew it was Mark. The language used was exactly the kind of thing he'd say, curt, arrogant, and filled with the bizarre sense of superiority he always possessed. I had something to deal with. After I told my friend, her instant advice was to block the phone number and forget about it. However, I couldn't just forget about it. I couldn't understand why he was still bothering me when I was no longer involved. What was he trying so hard to prevent me from finding out? I began to investigate. The more information I uncovered about Mark, the more unanswered questions I had. I wasn't very familiar with him, only knowing his first name and that he used to live somewhere else. So I did what most people would do. I looked him up online. Initially, I didn't get many results. His name was incredibly common. But after spending maybe an hour looking at search results, I found an old court document from a nearby state. And there it was. Mark's complete name, connected to an eviction case from 3 years back. That wouldn't have been too alarming, but there were 3 more lawsuits listed under his name, 2 more eviction filings, and 1 for unpaid debts. I just sat there looking at the computer trying to figure this out. It appeared this guy had a history of money problems. But why would my mom let someone like that move into her home? I determined that I should keep searching. If there were public records available, I could potentially discover more. And then I got lucky. I discovered a warning on a local online forum from someone in his former town. They were cautioning people about a man named Mark who swindled their aunt out of large sums of money by pretending to be in love with her. Based on the post, he would begin dating women, move in with them, and convince them to. People would either lend him money or let him use their accounts, and then vanish. His description was spot on. Initially, he was captivating, but then became domineering and had a habit of separating the women he targeted from their loved ones. It was like a case study. All of a sudden, everything became clear. Marx was pushing to have me removed from the house. His odd control over my mother. Also his remarks about her using her home's value and selling it if she wanted a new beginning. I recognized that I needed to inform her. That evening, I phoned her, prepared to share everything. I figured she'd be shocked. I hoped she might be thankful, possibly even say she was sorry about kicking me out. Instead, she became guarded. "Where are you getting this information?" she questioned, her tone harsh. "You hardly know him. You've been trying to wreck this relationship from the beginning." I attempted to remain composed, but my exasperation overflowed. I told her about the court documents, the online forum, the history of his actions. I pleaded with her to at least check it out herself. That's when she said something that completely destroyed me. "I don't care about his background. He's different now. And perhaps if you weren't behaving so immaturely, you'd realize that too." I slammed the phone down, trembling with rage. How could she support somebody like him instead of her own kid? However, deep down inside, I knew it wasn't really her speaking. It was Mark. He'd gotten to her. A week later, my mom stopped responding to my calls when I went to see her. She refused to answer when I knocked on the door of the house. Instead, Mark emerged and flatly informed me that I wasn't welcome back there anymore. He said my mom didn't need my negative vibes in her life. He gave me a box containing the remaining things I hadn't been able to fit in my vehicle when I initially departed, and told me to take the box and leave her alone. It was at that point that I understood he had completely taken control. Somewhere in there, my mom was still present, but she was hidden under whatever power Mark held over her. Since I used to help my mom with her money, I had access to her online banking. I wasn't thrilled that I was logging in without her agreement, but I had to understand what was happening. In the last 30 days, there had been many withdrawals, adding up to over $10,000. It was way more money than my mom could possibly afford to lose. She had also obtained a new credit card, something she hadn't done in ages, and used it to its maximum limit in under a month. It wasn't difficult to see what was transpiring. Mark was taking advantage of her financially. Then I got the second text message. It arrived late at night while I was in bed, attempting to figure out what to do. It said to stay out of it. The message indicated that this didn't involve me and that I would regret it if I kept interfering. At that instant, I realized I wasn't only dealing with a shady swindler. Mark was a threat, and if I didn't do something quickly, my mom could lose everything, including her safety. That's the only path I saw. Sitting in my car in front of my mom's house, I was trying to psych myself up. To keep fighting for her. Mark had cut her off from everyone, bled her dry financially, and was now warning me to back off. However, I couldn't just abandon her, not when I suspected there was a much deeper issue at play. But the difficulty was, how can you rescue someone who doesn't want to be rescued? I began with the information I already had. The bank records were alarming enough. Over $10,000 vanished in a few short weeks, a credit card that was maxed out, and cash withdrawals that were totally illogical for a person living hand to mouth. Nevertheless, it wasn't sufficient to persuade my mother. She'd already made it plain that she didn't trust me. I required something that couldn't be argued with, proof that was so obvious that even Mark couldn't manipulate it. That's when a family friend, Dan, who used to be a private investigator, popped into my head. It seemed like a long-odds scenario. However, I contacted him, described the circumstances, and asked him for assistance. To my astonishment, he said yes. Dan immediately got to work. In a matter of days, he'd uncovered so much damaging information about Mark that it made me sick. Here is what Dan discovered. Mark was his real name. His proper legal name was totally different, explaining why I'd struggled to find more info on him online. He had a criminal history. Fraud, identity theft, and even a handful of domestic arguments were all recorded. Most of those issues occurred in another state. That's likely the reason my mother was unaware when she did her standard pre-dating online investigation. It's funny considering she's always been super cautious when it comes to online relationships. He'd done this before, apparently. Dan uncovered 3 other women who had lodged grievances or legal actions against Mark. The story was always the same. He would move in, get his hands on their money, and then leave them with nothing when things went south. There was even one time when he'd tried to get his name on a property deed. As Dan described the particulars, I felt a wave of despair. This wasn't just about my mom and her bad choices. This guy was a skilled con artist, and he was talented at it. Now I was faced with a decision. I could show my mom everything Dan found and risk her completely rejecting me, or I could contact the authorities and let them deal with it. A part of me was concerned that if I involved the police, it could backfire. Mark would spin it to make it look like I was attacking him, and my mom may never forgive me, but then I thought about all the other women he'd harmed. How many additional lives would he destroy if I didn't intervene? That's when I made the call. The police didn't seem particularly concerned at first. They explained that it was a civil disagreement, and that unless my mother herself filed a report, there wasn't much they could do. I was discouraged, as if I'd reached a dead end with no way through it. However, Dan proposed something then that altered the whole game plan. If he's still utilizing fake names and made-up identities, that counts as fraud. They would be required to take that seriously. He was spot on. When I shared the details with the authorities, things shifted. After they learned about the false identity and his past offenses, they began to pay attention. I was then asked to send them copies of the bank records, the online forum conversations I had found, and everything that Dan had discovered. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to begin an official inquiry. Then the situation became complicated. About a week later, I received an extremely distressed phone call from my mother. She was sobbing, finding it difficult to speak clearly. The police, it seemed, had come to our home to interrogate Mark, and he had completely lost control. He started yelling at her, blaming her for what he saw as a betrayal, and then ran out of the house. He took a bag filled with her jewelry and whatever money he could find. I asked her if she was all right, but she just said, "Why would you do this to me?" I felt sick to my stomach. She still believed I was in the wrong. However, the truth came out sooner than I anticipated. A few days following Mark's disappearance, my mother got a call from the police. They had caught him in another state on suspicion of financial fraud and identity theft. While they searched his car, they discovered forged identification documents, credit cards with other people's names, and even a notebook containing passwords and sensitive account information. As it turned out, Mark was getting ready to empty my mom's retirement funds. He had even started making fake documents to add his name to the property deed. When she was told all of that, she finally broke down. She called me, crying uncontrollably, and said, "I'm so sorry, you were right about everything." It wasn't the reunion I'd hoped for. I didn't get the reaction I expected. While I wished I could be thrilled she'd seen things clearly, I couldn't seem to get rid of the rage bubbling inside me. She chose him instead of me. She permitted him to ruin what we had, simply because she was so desperate to think he was a better person than he actually was. Our connection is getting better gradually, however. It doesn't feel like it used to. Now she's attending therapy sessions to understand why she allowed someone like Mark to become a part of her life. Meanwhile, I'm still crashing on a friend's couch, working hard to accumulate enough funds to eventually get an apartment.